This podcast contains discussions on sexual misconduct. Topics such as sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment may be discussed. Listener discretion is advised. In this episode, I speak to Seyi Akiwowo, author and leading voice on digital safety, and founder of a nonprofit committed to ending online abuse.
A junior woman making a complaint to her employers about her boss sexually abusing her. Fantastic. The boss was absolutely confused. Like, I don't know what you're talking about. I haven't spoken to you in that way. I thought we were fine. You want to believe the victim, you want to believe the survivor. Obviously, kind of long story short, turns out somebody was manipulating the boss's voice.
This is the #NoExcuse podcast, discussing the challenges and complexities and potential solutions in preventing and responding to sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment in the aid sector. Through interviews with victims and survivors, experts, aid workers, artists, and leaders. The podcast is produced by the World Health Organization's Department for the Prevention and Response to Sexual Misconduct. I am Guni Dias, your host and global focal point for the department. Seyi, welcome to the #NoExcuse podcast.
Thank you so much for having me, Guni.
So today we're going there, into the dark corners of the digital workplace, and we're going to talk about online sexual abuse. Oh, it's no brainer. The way we've worked has changed, and according to Gallup, over 80% of employees in the US are now, working either remotely or in a hybrid setup. And while it's great to have flexibility, it also brings new risks. And I remember speaking to the Professor Frank Dobbin from Harvard University, and he said abuse happens when no one's watching. He was saying how it could be during late night shifts. And if we were to, apply it to the aid sector, it could be during vaccine campaigns as people knock on people's doors. And so now with this whole digital space, it can be in Zoom rooms, WhatsApp chats, the quiet DMs on LinkedIn. And I think the biggest challenge is that it's much more harder to detect and confront and also report. And so I thought you were the perfect guest to have on the show because you're known to challenge how we think about safety, especially on in digital spaces. So let's get into it.
Thank you so much for having me, and I hope I can help add a different perspective to the conversation, a much needed conversation. So I hope I can add something unique.
So is it me, or is online sexual abuse or misconduct in the workplace a myth?
No, it's definitely not a myth, and I want to agree with you that flexible working, remote working, I founded my organization, being remote working is a beautiful luxury and experience, and much needed for a lot of people with different accessibility needs, different working styles, and to be honest, economically. But the risks that were there in offline spaces, in offline workspaces, are going to be in online spaces. It's not a new thing. My issue is that because we haven't been dealing with the misconduct offline, we haven't actually set standards, behaviors. We've got an issue with consent, which I hope we can get into in a moment. These things have now been exacerbated online, and there is more of a feeling of getting away with it. So I think the online space, remote working has shone a light in different work practices, and particularly the ones that we're uncomfortable discussing already.
Mm-hmm. And do we have any data on this?
Unfortunately, there isn't. There isn't data, surveys, interviews, research specifically on online sexual misconduct in the workplace, which I think in itself is telling. We do have statistics, global statistics. So, for example, the International Labour Organization conducted a global survey in 2021 and found that 1 in 5 employed individuals have experienced one form of violence or harassment at work during their working life. And we know that women are disproportionately impacted, queer communities are disproportionately impacted, those from working class backgrounds are disproportionately impacted, and how the online space could be this whole new forum for harassment to happen. So we can make inferences, we can make suggestions, we can make policy recommendations from existing research, but sadly, online sexual harassment in the workplace is not well researched. But that doesn't mean that we don't know that violence offline and online aren't part of one continuum. That doesn't mean that we know that perpetrators will find tactics and ways to get away with it, particularly with anonymity, particularly with, oh, it was a mistake, particularly with, saying things like, it wasn't me, I was hacked. So we will need research from unions and labor organizations. But I think where we know where there's power, there is always risks of vulnerability. So yes, we do need statistics, but I don't think that's going to be what addresses this myth belief. I think it's culture. I think it's policies. I think it's leadership. I think it's a wider conversation.
Mm-hmm. And so if we were to explore the idea of accountability in this, and I know you've done a lot of work around online safety. So there's different agents in this conundrum of how do we approach accountability. There's the individuals, organizations, tech companies, governments. And if we were to start with the tech industry, who make it all possible, those platforms, you've worked closely with tech companies on making social platforms safer. And with the rise of online abuse and sometimes leading to self-harm, suicide, I think those standards of the tech industries are showing us that their standards are failing to meet the basic needs of safety of their users. Why do you think that is?
Fundamentally, a lot of these tech companies are designed and founded by men and by a particular demographic of men as well. Class is an important factor in this, and vulnerabilities are not thought about, let alone designed around. And I think that plays a real factor in how these tech companies are then formed. I think because we don't tend to have these standards offline, so code of conduct, consent, faith in the criminal justice system, good HR policies, tech is only amplifying and illuminating a wider issue. And then also, I think there's a particular problem with setting a standard, a duty of care. So this was a term coined by Professor Lorna Woods and William Perrin from Carnegie Trust. And they were in the UK pushing for the Online Safety Act, which is a regulatory framework for social media companies, discussion forums, search engines, small sites, you name it, to have a duty of care. Unfortunately, that amendment was dropped before the bill passed, but it was now putting an emphasis that tech companies have a standard of care that they need to ensure for their users. And I think this is a cultural problem where tech bros, tech companies feel like they can get away with creating technology very quickly and apologize later. And we actually have to kind of rein that in, and not in ways that it's now seen as being against innovation. That's not the case, but it's making sure that innovation isn't happening at the expense of communities. In the workplace, there are ways in which companies can be given controls and around the way their platform is being used, what can be shared, controlling the times in which forums can happen. There is a way to have a very generative conversation around how can workplaces use these technologies to ensure they're not being used by bad actors, and making sure that security ultimately is there. If we flash back to 5 years ago, in lockdown, how many times did we hear about Zoom bombings? How many times did we hear about the security of the workplace being really, really at risk? And I think these comes with conversations, but to have a conversation, tech companies need to listen. And I think workplaces, consumers, users of tech need to feel empowered to say, as a digital citizen, I want my tech companies to be more responsible. And if not, we're going to use alternative platforms. And I think finally, the reason why we don't have this standard is because we have a monopoly in the market. If we had competition, if we had alternatives, if we had choice, right, which is what, if we look at another industry, fashion, if we look at another industry, the car industry, we have a choice in the types of cars or clothes we want to buy, which then pulls this kind of race to the top of standards of ethical means of production. We don't have an alternative to Teams and Zooms and all of those options. Tech companies have a right and responsibility. I think they should be made responsible for stress testing their products so that it can't be manipulated by bad actors.
So we've covered the tech industry. We've talked about what organizations could do. And I'm curious to know, what are your thoughts on digital citizenship? If you look at the individual and how they, behave on these platforms, if there were a case of, sexual misconduct or a case of abuse, there are kind of three different actors you could see. You could see the perpetrator, the victim survivor, and the bystander. I'd like to get your thoughts on this. How does digital citizenship comes into play when there's these three actors?
Yeah, so for me, digital citizenship is about the understanding that we have rights and responsibilities. And what does it mean for individuals who are using technology? I think it's in the everyday habits of small acts of treating people and supporting people the way that you would like to be treated and supported. So when we see someone being abused online, when we see something that's an uncomfortable comment, reporting it, checking that the person's okay, and really and truly being mindful of our words. I think there is a real flippantness in our community. I don't know if that's a word, it is now, but there is a real flippant behavior around the words and tactics and abuse, and we normalize it, and that then kind of sends a signal to tech companies that this behavior is okay, outrage content is okay, teaching the algorithms that we need to be seeing more of this rage content and overly sexualized content. One of the biggest forms of abuse that we're seeing at the moment is around AI, right? We're seeing, I'll give you some examples. We're seeing AI voice technology. I heard about a case of a junior woman making a complaint to her employers about her boss sexually abusing her. Fantastic. The boss was absolutely confused. Like, I don't know what you're talking about. I haven't spoken to you in that way. I thought we were fine. You want to believe the victim, you want to be the survivor. Obviously, kind of long story short, turns out somebody was manipulating the boss's voice through an AI voice technology and pretending to take phone calls with this junior member of staff, overly sexualized conversations, which was recorded, all the things that victims have been told to do, to find out that actually they were being pitted against each other and they were both victims of online harms. We're seeing that. And so we need to ask ourselves, is this how we want our technology to be used? And how can workplaces who have a duty of care to their staff mitigate against these risks? That means staying on the pulse. It means having podcast conversations like this with experts around different ways innovation is being misused. Another example of harm with technology that we're seeing is around deepfake technology. So deepfake, for those that don't know, is creating synthetic media, and it can be of completely generated through AI now, or it can be a photo of you and I post it through this technology, and it can nudify us. And what we're seeing is that there is a real increase, there's a real disproportionate number of nudified apps being used to nudify women in pornographic ways. So there's a real gendered lens to how this is being misused. So the responsibility of ourselves as society is not making this an interesting thing to use. I'll give you another example. Taylor Swift has been a victim of deepfake of her being made naked online, and that was spread. Well, the first question I asked myself is, why was that being spread? Why didn't we report that? Why don't we take that down? Why have we shared that in gossip sites, forums? Why have we made this as something to be discussed, which is then signaling to algorithms, signaling to companies who want to make profits through ads on social media? And we've got to be responsible for what we're spreading. I share this story a lot about my time working with some folks in Taiwan and just hearing how their culture is around digital citizenship. They have this culture where fact checking is so important, that they don't want to be a conduit of spreading misinformation because they know how harmful this can be with, geopolitics at play. And I think we need to get that kind of digital citizenship culture in us and being responsible in so many ways of our language, of our act, of being a conduit and being a bystander, and active bystanders that is low stakes. That doesn't have to mean this big superhero Marvel type scenario. And it's a practice. It's a way of shifting our behaviors with each other as communities offline and online.
But what do you think it is about humankind and human nature that we love the gossip, we love when it's negative, and we love to continue to spread the negativity behind a computer and hide behind that?
Yeah. I'm not a psychologist or a behavioral expert, but I am a practitioner and I deliver, workshops and hold spaces around this. So I do believe that you can shift behaviors through practice. And I think it starts with role modeling. And if we, as the older generation online, aren't shaping alternative ways of engagement, then human nature is going to keep growing and festering around the bad parts of ourselves. I don't think we're going to completely eradicate gossip. I don't think we're going to completely eradicate harm, but I do think it's disproportionate online. I do think that we don't have enough of us being amplified for the ways in which we are being respectful online, the positive dialogues, the positive debates, holding multiple truths, emotional resiliency, emotional maturity. How do we signal to platforms that positive engagement, which we know is there, right? People love a cat photo, people love a dog photo, people love to watch inspiring positive content online. But I don't think there's enough of us teaching that algorithm that that's what we want to see. And we're not letting shareholders of these tech companies say that's actually where you can make money. And I think human nature, particularly with the global crisis that we still continue to be in a compounding way, the economy, isolation, that needs to be looked at. That needs to be looked at more broadly for why then people are trying to get these dopamine hits in the most cruel ways, which doesn't serve them and definitely doesn't serve society.
So what do you think that governments can do? I know that in the EU recently, the Digital Service Act got out. I know you've been involved in this and you have quite a few thoughts on this. Curious to know what you think.
Yeah, I think governments play an important part. And I know that they are coming up against organizations, civil society groups, and genuine concerns of government overreach, surveillance, big government, and all of that. But I do think that governments play a huge role in making sure that we set legislation and we set standards of companies, of workplaces, and that standard should be about being proactive than only being reactive. So in the EU, we've got the Digital Services Act, which is about regulating tech companies and data. It's a very holistic piece of legislation, and that I think is powerful because it brings all the EU member states together to be singing from the same hymn sheet against a multi-billion-dollar industry, right? And so there's safety in numbers, and there's sharing of intel, and there's sharing of practices, and the ways technology is being manipulated, and the way certain tech company leaders are also manipulating political crises and government need and the economy. I think that is really important there. I think legislation around employment, and workers' rights. My background is in the kind of labour union, so I'm always going to be advocating for that. And in the UK, there was an amendment to an act called the Workers' Amendment Protection, particularly on sexual harassment in the workplace. And they placed the proactive duty on employers to be proactively ensuring that workplaces are safe, particularly when it comes to sexual harassment. And that has got to include online sexual harassment and being proactive around how tech can be used. So thinking about a risk assessment. And my role as founder and CEO, working in partnership with other organizations and in coalition, that was really important for the Online Safety Act in the UK, was pushing for a risk-based approach to product development, and think, like I said earlier, about stress testing products and before they're rolled out, but thinking through the risks from a gendered perspective is key, and is one thing that governments can be mandating tech companies to do. The alcohol industry have a duty of care. They have to put responsibility messaging out. Why should the tech industry be separate to that? Why should they get away with that? And I think the biggest thing that I'm passionate about what governments can do is talking about harm, safety, community, human rights, all of that, also through a business lens. If I was a businessman in a more traditional industry, say manufacturing, I would be a little bit peeved with the way tech companies get away with so much. And it doesn't feel like there's any real learnings from when tobacco industry kind of blew and it wasn't regulated and they were able to lie about the harm of tobacco. It feels like we're having the same kind of wave. And I would encourage governments and those who can influence governments, right, to be thinking about what's good business practice. It's not good business practice for 50% of the population to be not feeling safe at work. It's not good business practice that could potentially mean that there is a lack of diversity in the company, which we know impacts profits, impacts effective strategy implementation and employment and all of that. Like, it's not good business practice to not want to have safety, inclusion, and regulation. And I think that's what governments could be doing, really being a thought leader, that this is not a add-on or we're making your life difficult for you and we're against innovation, but this is actually good business practice, and we want good business for a good society.
Yeah. You sound very passionate about this, and you've done a lot of work around it. What keeps you going?
Talking to people. And I've very much felt a re-energized wave and hearing different perspectives. I went to the 200th anniversary of the railway in the UK. I know, very weird, but I now understand why people like trains. And it was this art production through AI firework drones, which was fascinating, which is another example of why how tech can be good for society, right? Because it's now not going to fireworks have an environmental impact, right? A negative environmental impact, and now AI can address that. So anyway, in the north of England, learning about the birth of the railways through art, through culture, through music. And then as the production went on, you could see the divide, the geographical divide between the north and the south, and where certain railway tracks were placed and what that meant for certain communities, how that ended traditional forms of transportation, so ports and boats and all of that, and that made people unemployed. We're seeing the same conversations with AI and the fears that this is going to take people's jobs. We're seeing the same ramifications and interest when we have a technological revolution. And I get amazed by it and inspired by it, because there are ways in which we can avoid repeating history. We can avoid there being the divide. We can avoid there being the exclusion. We can learn from our elders. And so I think that I draw a kind of wisdom from other forms of technological advancement to really understand this space. And I think because I can just see, as a visionary, I can just see there can be an alternative. There can be a way out of this, and there can be a way of doing this in community and doing this through shared values and practice, and us all playing our part, rather than what I felt like when I started coming into this space 8 years ago was government blaming tech blaming parents blaming school teachers. It felt very divided. And if there's one thing that I feel really happy about and keeps me going, is that I try to connect different people. I try and connect different parts of the ecosystem, that we don't turn against each other, but we stay focused on this common vision, which is a responsible AI tech future.
How does it feel like to be one of the many voices that are out there that speaks about online, online abuse, but, are not necessarily representing people of minority, just because I'm assuming it's mostly white and male. Is it a correct assumption, or?
I am usually sometimes the only woman in conversations. I'm sometimes usually the only woman of color. And I'm sometimes usually the only person that can have a perspective into the global South. And I see it as my responsibility to not gatekeep, to convene where possible, to pass on opportunity. I had the privilege of hosting or moderating a panel last week, and I'm a survivor of online gender-based violence as a woman in politics, and I was abused by neo-Nazis online. And on the panel was somebody who was a young white working class lad up in North who was groomed and radicalized into the far right, and be able to sit there and say, we have been victims in very different ways of the same radicalization because of the same vulnerabilities, because of the same need that we have. I'm enjoying, slightly overwhelmed, but I'm enjoying trying to have an expansive conversation around what do we have in common? What are the vulnerabilities that lead to radicalization, that lead to isolation, that lead to this division, that lead to people using technology in this mind-blowing, negative, dark way? And how do we start having a public health conversation about this? How do we start looking at some of the drivers and the causes? Because that's actually something we can all be united around.
So if you were to make the case that prevention on online abuse was a public health issue, how would you phrase that?
Well, we know prevention is better than cure. So if we look at a young person who has abused or shared a video of a girl that was naked underage, that now brings in the police, that now brings in the school community, that now brings in the teachers. There's now needing to be a investigation. Then you've got the local authorities that will be involved, potentially safeguarding. There could be social work. That's just phase one. Then you've got, is it going to go to court? Then you've got the kind of aftermath of therapy for both sides, rehabilitation for the perpetrator, you name it. That is costly. That is very, very expensive, emotionally, financially. It's a cost. And I really believe looking at online abuse as a public health issue would save us so much money and time. This is costly. This is a cost to the human. This is cost to our human rights. This is a cost financially. So I'd be saying, let's invest in mental health services. When I was going through my abuse, no therapist, could really understand what I was going through because it was quite new. There is now studies to say that the mental health service is in a crisis and has a long waiting list. And the majority of the issues is to do with some form of online conduct or experience, whether that's body dysmorphia, suicide ideation, you name it. Mental health services are at a breaking point. We need to invest in our education system. We need to be talking about digital citizenship, media literacy, not just how to spot misinformation and disinformation, but how to be responsible online, how to be critical thinkers. And I think isolation has to be a public health priority because there is a lot of polarization happening. And if you're isolated and you're wanting to fit in, you're wanting to be seen, it is very dangerous to now become groomed by bad actors who want you to join their gangs, want you to push drugs, want you to push a particular rhetoric. You're going to be more vulnerable to these recruiters, if you like. And isolation definitely is a root driver of all of this.
And on top of what you're saying, WHO declared loneliness as a pressing global health threat. And with numbers where social isolation and loneliness are widespread, with an estimation of 1 in 4 people experiencing social isolation.
And I come into this space around digital citizenship or even ending online abuse because I believe in the power of the internet and technology and it bringing people together.
Thank you so much, Seyi, for your passion, your work, and continuing to spread this awareness on how to be safe online.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening. If you have any feedback or questions, feel free to reach out to us to prseah@who.int. Until the next time, goodbye.